Well, let's move ahead to the sutures of the skull. We have the zygomatic. Well, let's move to the sutures of the skull, and the first one we have zygomatic-maxillary sutures, and these are found between zygomatic and maxilla. As mentioned earlier on, during our discussion on the fontanelles, we were able to identify these sutures via the names of the bones, at least of which they join them together. So for the next suture is the frontal nasal suture, and these are the sutures between frontal and nasal. Then have metopic sutures. This passes between unfused frontal halves and only rarely persists into adulthood. Then we have coronal sutures. They lie between the frontal and the parietal bones. We have else lambdoidal sutures, and this passes between the parietals and the two occipital bone. So never be scared, because as we will be moving to the individual bones of the skull, maybe differentiating them between the others, we will be able to discuss much about these sutures and their joining to other bones. We as well have other sutures as squamosal sutures are unusual scale-like bivalve sutures between the temporal and the parietal bones. We have the spheno-occipital or basilar sutures, and this lies between sphenoid and occipital bone. We have parietomastoid sutures, and this passes between the parietals and the temporals, constituting to the posterior extension of the squamosal sutures. So this is an extension of that squamosal suture which we have just mentioned. Then we have occipitomastoid suture, and this passes between occipital and temporals on either sides of the vault. We have the sutures with us here as this image or the architecture of the skull on the which is demonstrated or is illustrated by the lateral view. Then we have the first part, the coronal suture, which is right here joining the bones of the frontal and the parietal. Then we have another suture labeled by 4, which is sphenofrontal suture, the suture between frontal and the sphenoid bone. Then we have the part labeled 7, which is nasomaxillary suture. Then we have the part labeled 9. Right here we have lacrimomaxillary suture. Then we have the part which is 10. Let me just move you to the part labeled 10 by my pointer, and that is ethmoidolacrimal suture. Then we have the part labeled 21 is the squamosal suture. 22 is the lambdoidal suture. Then 24 right here is known as the parietomastoid suture. Then finally 27 is the suture known as the occipitomastoid suture. So those are the sutures which are mainly found on the surface of the skull, and I did say the like joints which join one bone to the other. So let's move ahead to another level whereby we have with us the cranial fossa, and the fossa is a cavity, as I did mention earlier on, is a cavity within the skull. The major function of this cavity is to hold the brain and other vessels that are found within the brain or the neurocranium. So as the cranial bones form around the developing brain, they create a mold that approximates the brain's shape. If the calvaria, the roof of the cranium, is removed, the floor of the cranium displays 3 distinct levels that correspond to the major contours of the inferior surface of the brain. The 3 distinct regions of the floor of the cranium are called cranial fossa. As I did say, is a cavitation whereby the brain anchors. A specific structural region of the brain fits snugly into each cranial fossa, and these fossa are named as anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Let's just check on this fossa which I've mentioned. We have the anterior cranial fossa right here, occupying this whole level of the cranium, especially the anterior region. And we have the middle cranial fossa. As you can see the shape, which seems to be like a kind of butterfly. Then we have the posterior cranial fossa. Majorly, this is the occipital bone occupying this part. We have the sphenoid bone, at least we have the sphenoid bone. Then we have the frontal bone and some of other bones which forms the anterior cranial fossa. The highest level, the anterior cranial fossa, is formed largely by the portion of the frontal bone that constitutes the roof of the orbit and nasal cavity. The crista galli and the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone in lesser wings and part of the body of sphenoid bone forms up this what is known the anterior cranial fossa. So all these structures like crista galli and the cribriform plate, we will just get to them as we will be discussing exclusive bone as said before. So they whole build up this anterior cranial fossa. And what's the function of the anterior cranial fossa? This fossa houses the frontal lobes of the cerebral hemisphere of the brain. For those who have gone beyond or those who have read in advance, they've been able to identify the parts or the structures of the brain, and at least you have got a point that the cerebral hemisphere of the brain it's being housed by the anterior cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa is inferior and posterior to the anterior. It is bounded by the sphenoid bone that surrounds it. It's shaped like a butterfly, as said before, with a small median portion and two expanded lateral portions. The median portion is formed by part of the body of the sphenoid bone, while the lateral portion are formed by greater wings of the sphenoid bone in the temporal squama and the parietal bone. The middle cranial fossa cradle the temporal lobes of the cerebral hemisphere and the pituitary. So this is a gland which is being housed by this middle cranial fossa. And like the anterior cranial fossa, you've been able to identify the structures which builds up this fossa. Finally, we have the posterior cranial fossa, is the largest of the fossa, being at the most inferior level. It's formed mostly by the occipital bone and the petrous and mastoid portion of the temporal bone. It's a very deep fossa that accommodates the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata of the brain. So these are just about the structures or other elements within the cranium. So we have the fossa and some nerves which are seen or can be found within the fossa. As for this case, we have the olfactory bulb at the anterior cranial fossa. We have the part labeled 2 as the optic nerve. So these are just but the vessels and nerves or the neural elements found within the specific cranial fossa. This part, we can just identify a few of them. From this point to this point, so the whole level of this part is the anterior cranial fossa. First of all, we've been able to identify the olfactory bulb. The number 2 is the optic nerve, which is the nerve number 2 of the cranium. For those studying physiology, you can take at least some seconds to master some nerves of the brain or the nerves, major nerves of the brain which distribute their impulses, or they get impulses from different parts of the body. Like we have optic nerve, ophthalmic nerve, maxillary nerve, mandibular nerve, trigeminal nerve, and with the trigeminal ganglion, facial nerve, and vestibulocochlear nerve. Then we have glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, and the accessory nerve, anterior meningeal artery, internal carotid artery, oculomotor nerve, and the trochlear nerve, abducens nerve, middle meningeal artery and middle branch of mandibular nerve, greater and lesser petrosal nerve, basilar artery, vertebral artery, posterior meningeal artery, and recurrent meningeal nerve. Then have hypoglossal nerve. Finally, number 19 is the medulla oblongata that's found in the posterior cranial fossa. So majority of the neural elements are within middle cranial fossa, which runs from this point to these parts. then to this part, then finally the drawing ends right here. So those are just but the vessels and the nerves found within specific cranial fossa. As for the case, this is just but a summary table showing those nerves and the neural elements of the neurovascular elements. As I did said, on the anterior cranial fossa, we have the olfactory nerve, which is nerve number 1, anterior ethmoidal artery in vein, and as well nerve and the anterior meningeal artery. The whole of they can all be found within anterior cranial fossa. Then we have the related foramina, which is lamina cribrosa, and finally the related region is the nasal cavity. In the middle cranial fossa, we have a majority of the vessels and the nerves, and including them are the optic nerve, which is nerve number 2, ophthalmic artery, which are the related foramina is optic canal, then the related region is orbit. We have oculomotor nerve, then which is the nerve number 3, in the trochlear nerve, as well the abducens nerve, ophthalmic nerve, and superior ophthalmic vein, and the related foramina or where it passes through is the superior orbital fissure and the related regions of the orbit. We have the maxillary nerve, and we have mandibular nerve, middle meningeal artery, middle branch of mandibular nerve, then internal carotid artery, and they are related to these structures which are placed on this table on the other side. So these are just but the vessels and nerves found within or a specific part of cranial fossa. You can take at least some 5 seconds to review on those elements or those structures found within cranial fossa. Okay, let's proceed. Let's move to the cranial bone. The cranium is formed by superior aspect of the skull, and we have the 8 bones. The first one being frontal bone, which I'll be discussing to you during this session of discussion. Then we have parietal, which are paired, the number bringing us to 2. We have the temporal bones, 2, occipital bone, 1, then sphenoid bone is 1, and finally ethmoid bone is 1. These are the bones which forms up the cranial bone. So I'll start over by discussing about the frontal bone, its surface anatomy or surface structures and features, and I hope so you'll find something to tell or you add point to your knowledge. So let's get to the first bone, which is frontal bone, and it's especially found on the on the anterior aspect of the cranium. This is the frontal bone, and as well you can see other bones of the cranium. We have parietal bone, we have just at the back the occipital bone, we have sphenoid bone, but we shall discuss later about the sphenoid bone and other bones of the face. We have the vomer, we have the inferior nasal conchae. These are among the bones of the facial skeleton or facial component of the skull. We have the maxilla, which is the major bone of the face and holds the upper jaw. Then have the mandible, which is the lower jaw. We have the zygomatic or the cheekbone. We have with us the palatine. Remember, this is a disarticulated skull, which means it's separated from its normal position. Then we have the lacrimal bone, the nasal bone, and the temporal bone. Finally, that parietal bone of which I've mentioned. So let's get along. Let's consider only the frontal bone because that's of our major concern. We have that is the frontal bone and other bones of the same. So we'll be getting to each bone as we will be moving ahead. So what's all about frontal bone? So this just button, it's another image which is only demonstrating the posterior aspect of the skull when the skull is viewed from the posterior. But our major concern, let's now get to the frontal bone. The frontal bone forms the forehead, which is the anterior part of the cranium, the roofs of the orbit, which is the eye sockets, and most of the anterior part of the cranial floor. So that's where you can find the frontal bone. In most individuals, it is unpaired bone. Soon after birth, the left and right sides of the frontal bone are united by a suture called the metopic suture, which eventually disappears between the age of 6 and 8 years old. It articulates with parietals, nostrils, maxillae, sphenoid, ethmoid, lacrimal, and zygomatic bones. So those are the bones which are in close association with frontal bones. We have this is just but an illustration of frontal bone, and it's being painted by brown. This is the frontal bone. I did mention about its contact with other bones as nostril. We have the nostril bone here. We have the parietals there. We have the zygomatic, and we have other bones as well, which comes into more contact with the frontal bone. So as you can see on my right side, we have those other bones, which we shall be dealing with them as we'll be moving ahead. Also, this sphenoidal bone is in contact with the frontal bone, and that's really a fact. So about frontal bone, we have some structures on the surface and on the outer surface of the skull or the cranium is known as the ectocranium, while on the inside or the inner surface is known as the endocranium. So as I'll be mentioning these terms, please remember, because it will be of importance as we keep on with our discussion. So these are just a few structures found within frontal bone. Starting over from the point labeled 1, we have the nostril margin, 2 is the trochlear fossa, 3 is the fossa for the lacrimal gland, then we have 4, which is anterior ethmoidal foramen. The part labeled 5 is the posterior ethmoidal foramen. Then we have 6, this part, that's the dorsal spine. We have the part labeled 7 is the supraorbital notch. We have the other part labeled by 8 is the supraorbital margin. Then the part labeled 9 is the orbital plate. 10 being the roofs of ethmoidal air cells. Then we have the part labeled 11 is the ethmoidal notch. 12 moving as we move to this other image, which is especially drawn or it's illustrated by the endocranium. 12 is parietal margin. 13 is groove for superior sagittal sinus. 14 is the squamosal part of frontal bone. 15 is the frontal crest, this part. Then 16 is the foramen caesium. Then 17 is the dorsal spine. Then 18 is the zygomatic process of frontal bone. Finally, 19 is the juga cerebralia. 18 is the zygomatic process of frontal bone. I said maybe I did confuse a little bit. And then finally, I said is the juga cerebralia. So each and every part of the frontal bone has its specific function, or it demonstrates something which is of vital importance to the cranium or otherwise bone itself, the bone itself, right? Surface anatomy for the frontal bone, we have the frontal squama is the anterior vertical thick plate of bone that forms the forehead. We have the temporal lines on the lateral ectocranium surface. They mark the attachment of temporalis muscle and major elevator of the mandible. So while you'll be reading on your muscles and get to meet this muscle known as the temporalis muscle, remember where they get their attachment. Within the vertical portion of the frontal squama, the bone is hollow, and these hollow spaces are the paranossal sinuses called the frontal sinuses. we did discuss about the sinuses within the skull, or the paranasal sinuses, and I think you still do remember. So let's consider these specific structures and check where do they where are they exactly found. For the temporal lines, as you can check from my image, we have the temporal line right here. Then we have the frontal squama. Let's just check about the frontal squama. We have the frontal squama, which is the main part of this bone. Otherwise, we have other parts which maybe I didn't recognize from the previous images. Is frontal eminence, we have superciliary arc, we have supraorbital margin. I did show you that. Supraorbital notch, I did as well. Then we have metopic suture of the frontal suture. We did mention about that. The frontal eminence tubers or bosses dominates the ectocranial surface, and they mark the center of ossification of this bone. So from the previous images or from the previous illustration, we were able to identify these frontal tubers or the bosses, point where the flat bones begins to ossify, then they reach their maturity. Then let's have the arachnoid foveae. This is found next to the coronal suture, and they are associated with arachnoid, which is a vascular membrane layer covering the brain. The tufts of arachnoid push outwards against the dura, causing resorption of bone and the formation of foveae on the endocranial surface. So that point, or that part of which I did mention, the arachnoid foveae, the point where we have this association with another part known as the arachnoid itself, which is the membrane layer covering the brain, of which the tufts of arachnoid push outwards against the dura, causing the resorption of the bone and the formation of foveae on the endocranial surface. So this is majorly the physiologic part of the frontal bone, of which we have the development of that endocranial surface. Zygomatic process forms the most lateral and anterior corners of the frontal bone. Then we have superciliary arches. They are bonitory over the orbit. Supraorbital margin, we did identify that, are the upper orbital edges. Supraorbital notches are the foramina, are set along the medial half of the superior orbital rim. They transmit this specific nerve known as the supraorbital vessel. Sorry, it's not a nerve, actually, it's a blood vessel. And the supraorbital nerve, actually, I shouldn't have not said sorry anyways, as they pass superiorly to the forehead region. So the main function of the supraorbital notches or the foraminas, I think we have with us right there. It's supposed to be right there, which is pointed as 7, supraorbital notch. Then we have a supraorbital margin, and then we have the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. So for that, supraorbital notches, they transmit this major vessel known as the supraorbital vessels and the supraorbital nerve as they pass superiorly to the forehead. You've been able to check on the zygomatic process and the superciliary arches, and as well supraorbital margin, which are right there. Supraorbital notch, supraorbital margin, then zygomatic process of the frontal bone. We have the metopic suture, is a vertical suture, anatomy right and left frontal. How it persists as it is variable. I did mention about that, which it may just disappear at the age of between 6 to 8 years old for those growing children. Meningeal grooves from middle meningeal arteries are present on both sides of endocranial surface. Endocranial, I said it's the inner surface of the frontal squama or the frontal bone. Sagittal sulcus is a vertical groove that runs down the midline of the endocranial surface. It lodges the superior sagittal sinus, which is a large vessel that drains blood from the brain. So when you'll be reading on your physiology about these sinuses and other vessels of the brain, you'll be able to identify this part, which is known as the sagittal sulcus. Frontal crest is a midline crest confluent with the anterior end of sagittal sulcus, and this gives rise to the attachment of the false cerebri, a strong membrane between the two cerebral hemispheres of the brain. So those are the surface anatomy or the surface structures that can easily be identified within endocranium or otherwise ectocranium of the frontal bone. So arachnoid foveae are those stuff which can be seen right here and the other one right there. We have the sagittal sulcus, which is this area. Then we have the meningeal grooves. We have the frontal crest and the horizontal portion of the frontal bone. As well, we have the zygomatic process, and finally, foramen caesium. Let's check other structures. Is foramen caesium, which I've not mentioned. The foramen caesium is a variable size found on the root or the base of the frontal crest and transmits a small vein from the frontal sinus to the superior sagittal sinus. Pars orbitalis or orbital plate, which is right next to the orbital or where it forms part of the eye socket, is the horizontal portion of the frontals. Its endocranial surface is bumpy, conforming to the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. Yeah. So pars orbitalis of the plate, I'll show you again where it's located within the frontal bone. Lacrimal fossa for lacrimal glands are found on the lateral inferior parts of the orbital surface of the frontal, and I'll do again show you where they are seen from the real image. Ethmoidal notch is the gap separating the two orbital plates of the frontal. So let's go back to our image. What have I mentioned? We have had the lacrimal fossa and the ethmoidal notch. I think frontal crest, it's right there. You mentioned about fragmentation. I think well, we'll be getting down to our next image. Maybe we'll check on that. So for this case, we have the fossa for lacrimal gland, which is part labeled 3 right here. Then we have the part labeled 9 is the orbital plate. Then the part labeled by 11 is the ethmoidal notch, which I've done the discussion on them. So we have the pars orbitalis and the lacrimal fossa and the ethmoidal notch, and those are them. So that marks the end of our discussion of the day, and we shall meet on the next, or if God willing, we'll be able to touch on parietals, which forms part of the cranium or